What would you do if all you had left in the world were $3 and a grief so heavy it felt like a stone in your chest? What if you spent those last $3 on the one thing no one else wanted? A patch of dirt, a collapsed hole in the ground, a place synonymous with failure? The world would call you a fool. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten earth was a secret that would not only rewrite one woman's future, but the very map of the town that had dismissed her. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we tell the story of Jane Whittaker and the worthless claim that held a kingdom. Jane Whittaker arrived in the town of Promise, Dakota Territory, on the afternoon stage, which was really just a rattling wagon coated in a uniform layer of pale dust. She stepped down not with the hopeful energy of a settler, but with the quiet, weary stillness of someone who had nowhere else to go. She was 22, but the look in her gray eyes was older, worn smooth by a sorrow too new to have softened. Both her parents, taken by a fever back east within a week of each other, were now just a memory and a dull ache behind her ribs. They had left her with nothing but a small, worn satchel containing a change of clothes, a tarnished silver locket, and the last 3 silver dollars she possessed in the world. The town of Promise did not look promising. It was a handful of raw lumber buildings scattered along a wide, rutted street, a place that seemed to be holding its breath against the vast, empty prairie that stretched in every direction. The wind was a constant, a dry whisper that picked at the loose corners of her dress and carried the scent of dust and distant rain. She walked the length of the town, her worn boots sinking slightly into the deep dust. Men on the saloon porch stopped their talking to watch her pass, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and appraisal that made her pull her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Women, glimpsed through the windows of the mercantile, paused in their errands, their faces unreadable. She was a stranger and a woman alone, a fact that made her both invisible and intensely conspicuous. She felt their eyes on her back, measuring her, dismissing her. She had no trade to offer, no family to take her in, no money to buy herself a respectable place at the boarding house for more than a night or two. She had only a stubborn refusal to completely despair, a last ember of her father's practical nature that insisted on moving forward, one step at a time, even if the path was leading directly into darkness. She found the land agent's office at the far end of the street, a small, cramped room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The agent, a man with a sweat-stained collar and impatient eyes, barely looked up from his ledger when she entered. She stood before his desk, a ghost in a dusty dress, waiting to be acknowledged. He finally sighed, putting down his pen. "Well, what is it?" he asked, his voice rough with annoyance. Jane cleared her throat, the sound small in the heavy silence. "I'm looking for a piece of land," she said. "Something I can afford." The man gave a short, humorless laugh, looking her up and down, taking in the frayed cuffs and the worn-out boots. "Honey," he said, leaning back in his chair, "land takes money. You got money?" She didn't answer, just met his gaze, and for a moment, the sheer force of her quiet dignity seemed to surprise him. He grunted, turning to a large rolled map on the wall, and the conversation that followed would set in motion a chain of events that no one in Promise could have ever predicted. The agent, with a dismissive wave of his hand, pointed to a small, insignificant square marked on the very edge of the territorial map. "There's the old Miller claim," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Dugout caved in years ago. Ground's no good for farming. Too rocky for grazing. Been on the books so long, the paper's turning yellow." Just then, the door swung open, and a large, well-dressed man named Silas Croft entered, bringing with him an air of smug ownership. Croft was the town's foremost land speculator, a man who bought and sold futures, who saw the prairie not as a home, but as a commodity. He overheard the agent and let out a booming laugh. "The Miller ghost hole! You trying to sell that pile of dirt, Henderson?" He turned to Jane, his eyes sweeping over her with open contempt. "Ma'am, you'd be better off throwing your money in the street. At least then some poor soul might get a drink out of it." Henderson, the agent, shrugged, clearly embarrassed but also deferential to Croft. She asked what was cheap. Jane felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "How much?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the agent, ignoring Croft entirely. Henderson hesitated, then named the lowest price he could imagine for a deed, a price meant as an insult. $3, he said, for the deed and the dust. It was every cent she had. Silas Croft laughed again, a sound like rocks grinding together. $3 for a badger hole. Well, I'll be. Jane looked from the smirking agent to the contemptuous speculator. Something inside her, a core of defiance she didn't know she possessed, hardened like iron. They saw her as a fool, a charity case, a piece of driftwood. They expected her to shrink away in shame. Instead, she reached into her satchel, her movements deliberate, and placed her $3 silver on the dusty counter. The coins made a small, clear, final sound in the quiet room. "I'll take it," she said. A stunned silence fell. Henderson stared at the money, then at her, his jaw slack. Croft's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. He had meant to humiliate her, but instead he had watched her call his bluff with the last of her worldly possessions. She had bought the punchline to their joke. What secret could be buried in a collapsed hole in the ground? Was this the worst mistake of her life, or the beginning of everything? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Now, back to Jane, standing alone with a worthless piece of paper in her hand. Jane took the deed, a single sheet of paper with brittle edges, and folded it carefully, placing it in her satchel. She turned and walked out of the land office without another word, leaving the two men standing in a cloud of their own astonishment. As she stepped back onto the main street, the deed felt both impossibly heavy and utterly insignificant. It was hers. The joke was hers now. The whispers started almost immediately. The story of the orphan girl and the ghost hole claim spread through Promise faster than a prairie fire. As she walked toward the mercantile to spend the few cents she'd kept back for a loaf of bread and some matches, she felt the town's collective gaze settle upon her. It was no longer just curious. It was thick with ridicule. Women stopped their chatter on the boardwalks, their hands flying to their mouths to hide their smiles. Men lounging outside the livery stable nudged each other, pointing openly. Their laughter was not loud or aggressive, but it was everywhere. A low, persistent hum of mockery that followed her down the street. She kept her chin up, her eyes fixed on the horizon, pretending not to hear, pretending it didn't feel like 1,000 tiny needles pricking her skin. Silas Croft emerged from the land office and saw her standing there. He strode over, positioning himself so that others could hear. "Well, miss?" he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I do hope you've got a strong back. You'll need it to dig your own grave out there." He chuckled at his own wit, and a few of his cronies joined in. Jane simply looked at him, her gray eyes clear and still. She offered no retort, no defense. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any angry words could have. He grunted, his face reddening slightly, and stalked off toward the saloon. As the small crowd dispersed, a figure detached itself from the shadows of a nearby alley. It was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her hair in two long, silver braids. She was known in town as Mary Two Knives, a Lakota woman who lived apart from the white settlers, respected and slightly feared for her wisdom. She had watched the entire exchange. She stepped in front of Jane, her dark eyes holding a depth that seemed to see right through the girl's stoic facade. She looked at Jane, then at the dusty road leading out of town, then back at Jane. She raised one hand and pointed a long, slender finger toward the barren hills. "Some roots grow in the dark," the old woman said, her voice low and resonant, like stones shifting deep in the earth. "Don't be afraid of the soil." And just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and slipped back into the shadows, leaving Jane standing alone on the boardwalk. The cryptic words hung in the air, a strange counterpoint to the town's derision. Jane didn't understand what they meant, but the woman's tone had not been one of pity. It had been one of prophecy. The mockery stung, but the old woman's words felt like a shield, a secret she now carried against the town's scorn. Jane bought her small provisions and left the town behind, following the wagon-rutted track that wound its way west into the low, rolling hills. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the vast sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. The walk was longer than she expected, and the silence of the prairie was a stark contrast to the noise of the town. Here, the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the dry grass and the cry of a lone hawk circling high overhead. Her small satchel grew heavier with each step, and the loneliness she had held at bay now settled over her like a shroud. This was it. This was the sum of her life. A dusty road, a worthless deed, and a chorus of laughter echoing in her memory. She thought of her parents, of their small, tidy home with its vegetable garden and the scent of her mother's baking. Grief, sharp and sudden, threatened to overwhelm her. She pushed it down, focusing instead on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The land here was different from the town's flatter environs. It was broken country, creased with ravines and dotted with stubborn, rocky outcrops. It was land that fought back. Finally, as the light began to fade, she saw it. Set into the side of a low hill was a dark, gaping wound in the earth, half hidden by a thick tangle of sagebrush and weeds. A few rotted timbers jutted out from the collapsed mound of dirt like broken bones. This was the Miller claim. Her home. It was worse than she could have possibly imagined. The dugout hadn't just caved in. It looked as if the hill itself had sighed and decided to swallow it whole. The air around it was stagnant, holding the smell of damp earth and decay. Disappointment, cold and bitter, washed over her. Croft had been right. She had bought a grave. She slowly made her way closer, pushing through the scratchy brush. The entrance was completely blocked by a fall of rock and soil. There was no way in. A few feet away, a shallow depression marked where a small corral might have once stood, its fence posts long since rotted away to nothing. It was a place utterly devoid of hope. As the last light bled from the sky, a profound sense of desolation settled upon her. She was utterly alone, miles from a town that despised her, with no shelter and no prospects. She found a relatively flat patch of ground a few yards from the collapsed dugout. Sheltered from the wind by a rocky ledge, she unrolled the thin blanket from her satchel, sat down, and drew her knees to her chest. The stars began to appear, cold and impossibly distant in the blackening sky. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her. She simply sat and watched the moon rise, a silent witness to the vast, indifferent beauty of the land that had now claimed her last $3. That first night, huddled in her blanket with the lonely wind as her only companion, Jane Whittaker felt she had finally reached the very bottom of the world. The next morning, Jane awoke stiff and cold, the pale dawn light illuminating a world washed in gray. The bravado that had carried her through the purchase of the deed had evaporated in the chill of the night, leaving behind a grim, practical reality. She had a piece of land, but she had no shelter, no food beyond the half-loaf of bread in her satchel, and no plan. For a long moment, she considered simply walking away, heading down the track toward the next town, becoming another nameless, drifting soul on the frontier. But the memory of Silas Croft's sneering face and the quiet, knowing eyes of Mary Two Knives held her in place. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not be broken so easily. She ate a small piece of the bread, drank sparingly from her canteen, and then turned to face the mound of earth that was her property. She had no tools, only her own two hands. She started with the smaller rocks and loose clumps of sod, pulling them away from the choked entrance. The work was brutal and slow. Her hands, soft from a life spent indoors, were quickly scratched and raw. The sun rose higher, beating down on her back, and sweat traced grimy paths through the dust on her face. By midday, she had managed to clear a small opening, just large enough to peer into the darkness beyond. The air that seeped out was cool and musty. She worked for hours, her muscles screaming in protest, her initial despair giving way to a kind of numb determination. She was not thinking about building a home. She was simply focused on the immediate task. Move this rock, pull that root, clear this patch of dirt. As she dug deeper into the collapse, she began to uncover more of the dugout's original structure. She found the top of a rotted door frame and the charred remains of what must have been a hearth. The stones of the fireplace had been scattered by the cave-in. She began to lift them one by one, tossing them onto a growing pile. Most were rough, jagged pieces of fieldstone, but one, near the base of where the hearth would have stood, was different. It was a piece of darker, smoother basalt, squarer than the others, and it seemed to have been deliberately shaped. It didn't fit. The other stones were local rock, pale and sedimentary. This one was volcanic, foreign to the region. It was an anomaly, a detail that snagged in her mind. She paused, running her raw fingers over its cool, flat surface. Why would a poor homesteader, building a simple dugout, go to the trouble of finding and setting a single peculiar stone like this? It made no sense. For a moment, she was about to try and pry it loose, but a wave of exhaustion washed over her. It was just a rock. Her imagination was getting the better of her. She set the thought aside and continued her relentless labor, her body moving with a mechanical rhythm born of pure will. But even as she worked, the image of that single misplaced stone remained, a small, unanswered question in the back of her mind. Days turned into a week. Jane established a routine born of necessity. She found a small spring a half-mile away, refilling her canteen each morning. She learned to identify edible roots and berries, supplementing her dwindling supply of bread. And every day, from sunrise to sunset, she worked at the dugout. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. She had cleared most of the entrance, revealing a space choked with dirt, but recognizably a room. She had also uncovered enough of the support timbers to see that the remaining structure was dangerously unstable. One heavy rain could bring the rest of the hill down upon her. She knew she couldn't go any further on her own. She needed help, and help cost money. She took the one valuable thing she had left, the small silver locket with the tiny, faded portraits of her parents, and walked back into Promise. She sold it at the mercantile for a handful of coins, the transaction leaving a hollow space in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger. With the money clutched in her hand, she didn't ask for a laborer. She asked who was the most honest carpenter in town. The mercantile owner, a grudgingly decent man, pointed her toward a small workshop at the edge of town. "Daniel Price," he said. "He's quiet, does good work." Daniel Price was a man who seemed carved from the same timber he worked. He was tall and lean, with sawdust in his hair, and a sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. He had lost his wife to cholera the year before, and had since kept mostly to himself, finding solace in the clean lines of wood and the simple logic of a well-made joint. He listened to Jane's request without a word of judgment, his gaze calm and steady. He didn't mock her claim or question her purpose. He simply nodded. "I'll come look at it tomorrow," he said, his voice a low baritone, unused to conversation. The next afternoon, he arrived at the claim, his old horse pulling a small wagon with his tools. He surveyed the collapsed dugout, his practiced eye taking in the precarious angle of the remaining roof beams and the fissure lines in the earth above. "It's a bad one," he said, not with scorn, but with a carpenter's frank assessment. He spent an hour inspecting the site, his silence a comfortable thing. He pointed out details Jane had missed, the way the original builder had used long-lasting juniper posts for the main supports, the careful way the stones of the back wall had been fitted together. "Whoever built this," Daniel murmured, more to himself than to her, "meant for it to last." Together, they began the painstaking work of bracing the structure, shoring up the weak points so she could safely clear the interior. As they worked side by side in the cramped space, a quiet understanding grew between them. They spoke little, but they moved with a shared rhythm, two lonely people finding a temporary reprieve in common labor. While clearing the dirt and debris from the floor near the hearth, Jane's shovel scraped against that same dark, smooth stone she had noticed before. This time she stopped. "Daniel," she said, her voice quiet, "look at this." He came over and knelt beside her, running his hand over the stone's surface. He frowned. "That's not right," he said. "It doesn't belong." He took the pointed end of his hammer and began to carefully chip away the hardened dirt packed around its edges. It wasn't just a single stone. It was the cap of a small, carefully constructed cavity hidden within the foundation of the hearth. With a final pry, the stone came loose. Jane reached into the dark space behind it. Her fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and wrapped in what felt like oilcloth. Jane slowly drew the object out into the dim light of the dugout. It was a heavy iron key, its surface pitted with rust, but its form still strong and certain. The oilcloth it had been wrapped in was stiff with age, but had done its job, protecting the metal from the worst of the damp. There was no visible door, no chest, no lock that it could possibly belong to. It was a key to nothing. Yet, it had been hidden with deliberate care, tucked away behind a false stone in the heart of the home. Daniel looked from the key to Jane, a question in his eyes. "What for?" he murmured. A current of excitement, the first she had felt in months, coursed through Jane. This was not random. This was a secret. Together, they began a systematic search of the small earthen room. They tapped on the stone walls, listening for a hollow sound. They scoured every corner, every shadow. Nothing. Daniel stood in the center of the room, his brow furrowed in thought. A dugout like this, if they had a cellar, it would be in the floor. The floor was a mess of packed dirt, rubble, and loose stone. It seemed impossible, but Daniel began to pace, stamping his boot heavily. In one spot, near the back wall, the sound was different. Not a hollow echo, but a dull, solid thud. He stamped again. "Here," he said. They fell to their knees and began to dig with their hands, scraping away the loose earth. A few inches down, their fingers hit wood. They cleared a wider area, their movements frantic now, and slowly uncovered the edges of a large, flat door, its planks thick with age, set flush into the dirt floor. In its center was a heavy iron ring handle, and beside it, a keyhole clogged with soil. Daniel carefully cleaned the keyhole with a nail from his pouch. Jane held her breath as she inserted the old iron key. It slid in perfectly. With a grating shriek of rusted metal, the lock turned. They both gripped the iron ring and heaved. The door was incredibly heavy, but with a groan of protest, it lifted, revealing a square of perfect darkness and a flight of steep, stone steps leading down. A rush of cool, stale air, smelling of deep earth and time, washed over them. Lighting a lantern, Daniel led the way down. The cellar was small and stone-lined, impeccably built. It was a root cellar, but a fine one. On the far wall were empty shelves and old bins for potatoes and apples. But that wasn't all. At the back of the cellar, set directly into the earth wall, was another door, smaller and bound with straps of iron. It too had a lock. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. She approached it, the lantern light dancing on the rough-hewn wood. With a trembling hand, she tried the key. Again, it fit. The lock turned with another loud crack. This door opened not into another cellar, but into a chamber. It was a small, dry room, no bigger than a closet, but it was finished. The walls were planked. The floor was wood. It was a hidden office, a secret study. On a small, crude table in the center of the room sat a single object, a tin box, the kind used for deeds and important papers, secured with a small padlock. The iron key, it turned out, was a master. Its tip was shaped to also open the small lock on the box. With a final click, the lid sprang open. Inside there was no gold, no jewelry. There was something far more valuable. Lying on a bed of yellowed cotton was a thick ledger book, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a folded, official-looking document. Jane carefully lifted the document and unfolded it. It was an original territorial land grant, signed and sealed, not for the worthless few acres she had bought, but for the entire 320-acre valley to the east. The very same land that Silas Croft was currently dividing into parcels and selling for a fortune. The dugout hadn't been a home. It had been a hidden command post, the secret heart of a much larger claim. The discovery left them in stunned silence, the lantern light flickering on the pages that held the power to upend the entire town of Promise. The ledger, written in a neat, careful hand, detailed years of work on the larger claim. Fences built, wells dug, crops planted. The letters told a story of a homesteader named Elias Miller, a man writing to his brother about his hopes for the future and his growing fear of a ruthless cattleman who wanted his water rights. A man named Jedediah Croft, Silas's father. The last entry in the ledger was abrupt, dated 15 years prior. It simply read, Croft came today. God help us, they now understood. Elias Miller hadn't abandoned his claim. He had been driven off it. He had hidden the proof of his ownership in this series of secret rooms, hoping to one day return. He never did. Jane and Daniel sat on the edge of the open cellar door, the papers spread between them, the weight of the secret settling upon them. This was no longer about a worthless piece of land. It was about a profound injustice. But as they discussed what to do next, a shadow fell over the entrance of the dugout. Silas Croft stood there, flanked by two rough-looking men he employed. His eyes, small and hard, darted from Jane to Daniel, then to the open cellar door and the papers in their hands. A rumor must have reached him, a whisper about the carpenter spending days at the orphan's claim. "Trespassing, are we?" Croft said, his voice dangerously soft. "On my property." "This isn't your property, Mr. Croft," Jane said, her voice shaking slightly but firm. "And I think you know it." Croft's face darkened. "That's a worthless deed you're holding, girl. A clerical error. I'm here to rectify it." He took a step forward, his men fanning out behind him. "You're going to pack up and be gone by sunrise." Daniel rose to his feet, placing himself between Jane and Croft. He wasn't a large man, but his presence was solid, immovable. "You need to leave," Daniel said, his voice low and even. "This is her land." At that exact moment, the sky, which had been growing heavy and dark all afternoon, opened up. A deafening crack of thunder shook the ground, and a torrential downpour began, turning the dusty ground to instant mud. The storm was a physical manifestation of the conflict, wild and violent. Rain lashed down, driven by a furious wind. Croft and his men were momentarily taken aback by the storm's ferocity. He glared at Jane, then at Daniel, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he snarled, before he and his men retreated, scrambling for their horses in the deluge. The crisis was not over. As the storm raged, a new sound reached them over the roar of the wind and rain, a splintering crack and a desperate shout. Peering out, they saw a wagon on the nearby track, one of its wheels shattered, tilting precariously into a ditch. A man was struggling to control his terrified horse, while his pregnant wife huddled in the back, shielding a small child. Without a second's hesitation, Jane and Daniel ran out into the storm. They helped the family, the shepherds, out of the wrecked wagon and guided them toward the dugout. They brought them into the relative safety of the main room, and then down into the dry, protected cellar. Jane shared the last of her food and her only blanket, her own fear and uncertainty pushed aside by the immediate need of this stranded family. Huddled in the lamplight of that hidden room, surrounded by strangers she had just rescued, Jane Whitaker wasn't just defending a claim. She was building a home. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a sliver of moon. The shepherds, profoundly grateful, spent the night in the shelter of the dugout. The next morning, Daniel helped Mr. Shepherd repair his wagon wheel while Jane entertained their small daughter, showing her the smooth, dark stone from the hearth. When the family departed for promise, they carried with them not only their repaired wagon, but a story of a fierce storm, a kind young woman, and a strange, wonderful house built into the earth with secret rooms. That story was the first stone in the rebuilding of Jane's reputation. The town had mocked her for buying a hole. Now they heard she had used that very hole to give shelter to a family in need. Meanwhile, Jane and Daniel knew they couldn't wait. With the precious papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, they took Daniel's wagon and made the day-long journey to the territorial capital in Yankton. They found the office of the circuit lawyer, a stern but fair man named Judge Alistair Blackwood. He was the kind professional they needed, a man who dealt in facts, not in rumors or intimidation. He listened to their story patiently, his face impassive, as he examined the land grant, the letters, and the meticulously kept ledger. He compared the grant number to the official records in his archive. For a long hour, the only sound in the office was the rustle of paper. Finally, Judge Blackwood looked up, his expression serious. "The grant is authentic," he stated, his voice carrying the weight of law. "It predates Jedediah Croft's filing by 2 years. According to this document, and the supporting evidence in this ledger, Miss Whitaker, you are the legal holder of the deed to the entire Miller claim, all 320 acres of it." He went on to explain that Silas Croft's claim was based on a fraudulent abandonment filing made by his father. The ledger and letters provided clear evidence of duress. The news was so momentous, so utterly life-altering, that Jane could only sit there, speechless. The journey back to Promise was quiet, the air charged with a future that had suddenly opened up before them. When they arrived, the news, sent ahead by telegraph from Judge Blackwood's office to the local sheriff, had already begun to ripple through the town. The chorus of whispers that had once followed Jane was now different. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. People saw her now not as a fool, but as a force of nature. Silas Croft was waiting for them, not with his hired men, but alone, standing in the middle of the street. He looked smaller, diminished. The legal notice had been served. He was not a man who fought losing battles. He looked at Jane, the penniless orphan he had openly ridiculed, and in his eyes was the bitter understanding that she had beaten him. He didn't apologize, but he didn't have to. His public humbling was complete. He turned without a word and walked into the saloon, a man whose foundation of wealth and power had just been revealed to be built on stolen ground. By the time the first snows of winter fell, the dugout on the Miller claim was transformed. With Daniel's skill and Jane's unwavering vision, the collapsed hole in the ground had become a true home. Daniel had rebuilt the entrance with sturdy new timbers, adding a proper door and a glass-paned window that caught the morning light. The main room was snug and warm, with a new, efficient stove where the old hearth had been. The secret rooms below were no longer hidden. The cellar was stocked with preserves Jane had put up from late-season berries, and the small, planked office had become her quiet study, a place to read and plan. The larger valley, now legally hers, lay dormant under a blanket of white waiting for spring. The town of Promise had changed too. Or rather, its perception of Jane had. Families began to make the trip out to her claim, bringing small gifts of pies or a sack of flour, their curiosity now tinged with reverence. They saw the warm light in her window and the steady curl of smoke from her chimney, and they understood. She hadn't just found a deed, she had resurrected a home from the dust. The Shepherds became her first friends, visiting often. Outsiders, hearing the story of the lost Miller grant, began to arrive, interested in leasing parcels of the rich valley land from her for farming. She was no longer an outcast. She was the quiet, unassuming heart of a new and growing community. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the snow-covered landscape, Jane stood on the small porch Daniel had just finished building. He was beside her, sanding a rough edge on the railing, the simple, repetitive motion a comforting sound in the immense quiet. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, simply watching the light fade. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine smoke and winter. They had worked together every day for months, rebuilding the dugout, fencing a small pasture, their lives intertwining as naturally as the grain in a piece of wood. A bond of deep affection and quiet trust had grown between them, a love that didn't need grand declarations. It was visible in the way he handed her a tool without being asked, in the way she brought him a cup of hot coffee as he worked, in the shared silence that was more comfortable than any conversation. He finally stopped his sanding and looked at her, his gaze soft in the fading light. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Jane looked out over the valley. Her valley, the vast expanse of white and gold that held all the promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. A small smile touched her lips. "They thought I bought a hole in the ground," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I just found a place to put down roots." Daniel reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong around hers. He didn't say a word. He just held on, and together they watched the first stars appear in the deep blue winter sky. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage, a story that reminds us that true worth is often buried, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. If you were inspired by Jane's journey, please give this video a like and subscribe for more tales of the frontier. We'll see you in the next story. She was 19, and her uncle had made her homeless. She had no family left, no money to speak of, no plan, just a heavy iron key her grandmother had left her and the $37 her uncle had pressed into her hand. And with a portion of that $37, she bought a surveyor's map of the Bitterroot foothills. But what nobody knew was that the key in her pocket and a faint pencil mark on that map pointed the way to a stone house, a house built for the day a girl like her would need it most. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Nora Bassett had grown up in the lee of her grandmother's quiet competence. Her name was Eleanor Bassett, and she had been a woman who understood the language of wood grain and weather, of soil and seasons. She was widowed long before Nora was born, and she ran the small family farm not with brute strength, but with a patient, knowing economy of motion. Eleanor's hands, though gnarled by work and age, were instruments of creation. Nora remembered those hands planing a warped door until it swung true in its frame, setting a splint on a lamb's broken leg with strips of clean linen, and holding Nora's own small hands to guide a saw through a length of pine. "Let the tool do the work, child," she would say, her voice as soft and worn as old leather. "Your job is just to guide it." Eleanor taught Nora how to read the sky for rain, how to mix mortar, how to sharpen an axe, and how to listen to the silence of the high mountains and know what it was saying. The farm was their world, a small universe of 40 acres bounded by a creek and a stand of old-growth cedar. After Nora's parents died in a fever winter when she was only 6, Eleanor had been her only family, her teacher, and her shelter. The most precious thing Nora owned from that time, besides the skills themselves, was an old iron key. It was heavy, nearly 5 inches long, with an ornate clover-shaped bow and a complex, toothed bit. It went to no lock on the farm. "It's for a door you haven't found yet," Eleanor had told her once, a rare smile touching her lips. Some doors wait a long time to be opened. When Eleanor passed away in her sleep one spring morning, the world Nora had known fell silent. Her uncle Thomas, her father's younger brother whom she had met only twice, arrived from the city a week later. He smelled of cigars and impatience, and his city boots seemed to violate the soft earth of the farm. He saw not a home, but an asset, not a legacy, but a parcel of land with timber rights. He was a man who saw the world through ledgers and deeds, and in his accounting, A 19-year-old niece was a liability to be settled and dismissed. The ejection was not a moment of high drama, but of quiet, administrative cruelty. It happened on a Tuesday in late August, the air thick with the smell of cut hay and the coming autumn. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, the very table where Eleanor had taught Nora to knead bread, and laid out a set of papers. His signature was already affixed, a sharp, angular script that seemed to stab at the page. "The farm is sold, Nora," he said, not looking at her. He tapped a finger on the document. "The new owners take possession on Friday. You'll need to be gone by then." Nora stood by the dry sink, her hands clutching a damp dishcloth. She did not cry or plead. She had watched her grandmother face down drought, blight, and the loss of her own husband, with a stoicism that was less an absence of feeling and more a deep well of conserved strength. Nora drew from that well now. She simply nodded. "Where am I to go?" she asked, her voice even. Thomas finally looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. "That's not my concern. You're 19, an adult." He pushed a small stack of bills across the table. "This is what's left after settling Eleanor's debts and my travel expenses. $37. He said the amount as if it were a generous settlement, a final closing of the books on his familial obligations. Nora looked at the worn bills, then at her uncle's polished shoes. She thought of the years her grandmother had poured into this land, the calluses on her hands, the sweat that had fed the very soil beneath their feet. All of it reduced to a sum that would barely buy a week's worth of meals. She didn't touch the money. She turned and walked to the small bedroom that had been hers her entire life. She packed a single canvas satchel, 2 changes of clothes, a block of soap, a tinderbox, and the small leather-bound toolbox her grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday. It held a good hammer, a set of chisels, a small hand plane, and a sharpening stone. Into her pocket, she slipped the heavy iron key. When she returned to the kitchen, Thomas was gone. The $37 remained on the table. She picked it up, folded it once, and tucked it away. She walked out the kitchen door without looking back, the screen door slapping shut behind her with a sound of finality that echoed across the empty yard. The air was still and warm, and the mountains, the great, silent Bitterroots, watched her go. The journey began on foot. Nora walked down the long dirt lane that connected the farm to the county road, the dust rising in soft puffs around her worn leather boots. She did not look back. To look back was to invite a grief she did not have the strength to carry. Not yet. The weight of the canvas satchel on her shoulder was a grounding reality. The solid presence of her grandmother's tools, a comfort against her back. The road unspooled before her, a pale ribbon winding through the familiar landscape of rolling pastures and hayfields. But with every mile, the land began to change. The fields grew smaller, interrupted by stands of ponderosa pine and aspen groves that shimmered gold in the late summer sun. The road began to climb, gently at first, then more insistently, into the foothills. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine resin and cool stone. She walked for 2 days, sleeping rolled in her blanket under the vast, star-dusted sky, eating the bread and dried apples she had packed. On the 3rd day, she reached the small town of Harmony Creek, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a narrow valley. It was little more than a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and a handful of houses. In the Mercantile, a place that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and salt pork, she spent 2 of her $37 on a surveyor's map of the region. It was old, the paper yellowed and soft, but the topographical lines were clear. She spread it out on the store's counter, its surface worn smooth by a century of commerce. And there, in the far northwest quadrant, in a crease of the paper, was a faint, familiar mark. It was a small, neatly drawn circle made in pencil, with the initial E beside it. Eleanor. Nora's heart gave a small, sharp knock against her ribs. She remembered her grandmother poring over this very map years ago, her finger tracing the contours of the high country. She had thought nothing of it then. Now, it felt like a message sent across time. She bought a small sack of flour, a tin of salt, and a packet of jerky, her precious funds dwindling. She asked the storekeeper, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, about the mark. "That's old government land up there?" the woman said, squinting at the map. "Homestead claim, most likely. Nothing's been up that way for 40 years or more. No road, just an old game trail." Nora folded the map carefully and put it in her satchel. She had a destination now. It wasn't a plan, not really, but it was a direction. It was a thread to follow, spun by the hands of the one person who had never failed her. The next morning, she left Harmony Creek and struck north, following the creek that gave the town its name, pushing deeper into the mountains, toward the small pencil mark that held the shape of a promise. The game trail was little more than a whisper of a path, a faint impression in the pine needles and rocky soil that snaked its way up the side of the mountain. For 2 days, Nora climbed, the world of roads and towns falling away below. The air was sharp and cool, and the only sounds were the rush of the wind through the high pines, the chatter of a squirrel, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She was tired, her muscles aching with a fatigue that went bone deep, but there was a clean, sharp focus to her mind. She thought of her grandmother's hands, how they could find the straightest grain in a piece of wood, and she felt that she was doing the same, following the grain of the land toward an unknown purpose. On the afternoon of the second day of climbing, she found it. The trail opened into a small, high meadow, a bowl of green grass ringed by ancient firs, and there, on the far side of the meadow, tucked against a granite cliff face, was a house. It was made of stone, not rough field stone, but carefully cut and fitted granite blocks, the work of a master mason. The stones were a patchwork of gray and rose, silvered with lichen, and a thick carpet of moss grew on the heavy slate roof. A stone chimney, broad and solid, stood sentinel at one end. The windows were shuttered with thick, weathered planks, and a heavy oak door, bound with iron straps, was set deep into the front wall. It looked less like a house, and more like a part of the mountain itself, something that had grown there rather than been built. A feeling of profound stillness hung over the place. It was not the stillness of abandonment, but of patience, of something waiting. A small, clear stream ran from the rocks nearby, feeding a patch of wild berry bushes. As she drew closer, she saw the details of the craftsmanship. The joints between the stones were tight and true. The lintel above the door was a single, massive piece of hewn granite. This was not a hastily erected shack. It was a fortress, built to endure. She felt a tremor of recognition, a sense of rightness that settled deep in her chest. She dropped her satchel in the long grass and walked to the door. There was no rust on the iron hinges, only a dark patina of age. In the center of the door was a large, formidable iron lock. With a hand that trembled slightly, Nora reached into her pocket and drew out the heavy key. It felt cool and solid in her palm. She looked from the key's complex, toothed bit to the shape of the keyhole. They were a perfect match. She slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled precision, followed by a deep, resonant thunk as the bolt slid back. The sound echoed in the mountain silence. It was the sound of a door that had been waiting a very long time to be opened. Nora pushed the heavy oak door inward. It swung silently on its hinges, opening into a single large room filled with cool, still air and the faint, dry scent of cedar and old stone. A fine layer of dust coated everything, a soft gray blanket over a world held in perfect suspension. Sunlight, filtered through the grimy panes of a single unshuttered window high in the gable, cut a golden shaft through the gloom, illuminating a dance of dust motes. The room was simply furnished, but everything in it spoke of quality and intention. Against the far wall stood a large stone fireplace, its hearth clean and swept, with a stack of dry, seasoned firewood laid neatly beside it. A cast-iron cookstove stood near the hearth, its black surface dull with disuse but free of rust. In the center of the room was a heavy trestle table and two simple, sturdy chairs. A built-in bunk, piled with neatly folded wool blankets, occupied one corner, and along the opposite wall were shelves, filled not with clutter but with essentials: sealed tins, glass jars of dried beans and grains, sacks of flour and sugar, and neatly labeled wooden crates. It was a shelter, provisioned and prepared. Nora ran a hand over the smooth, planed surface of the table. It was the work of a skilled carpenter. She recognized the joinery, the careful fit of mortise and tenon, as her grandmother's work. This whole place was her grandmother's work. She felt Eleanor's presence not as a ghost, but as a palpable intelligence, a loving foresight that had reached across the years to this very moment. She spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, her initial awe settling into a deep, quiet gratitude. She unlatched and opened the heavy wooden shutters, letting fresh air and light flood the room. She found a well-made pump at a stone sink that, after a few moments of priming, brought up clear, cold water from a deep well. Behind the house, a small, sturdy shed held a trove of tools: axes, saws, a post-hole digger, a scythe, and a splitting maul, all cleaned, oiled, and sharp. There was even a small forge and anvil. It was a complete and self-sufficient world, built with a purpose Nora was only just beginning to understand. As evening fell, casting long shadows across the meadow, Nora felt a pang of deep, aching loneliness. The house was a gift, a miracle, but it was also a monument to her solitude. She laid a fire in the hearth, just as Eleanor had taught her, and as the flames caught and began to crackle, she noticed it. One of the hearthstones was slightly loose. It was barely perceptible, but her fingers, trained to notice such imperfections, found the slight give. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable curiosity, she took a chisel from her toolbox and gently worked it into the seam. The mortar was old, but gave way easily. She lifted the heavy stone. Beneath it was not dirt, but a hollow space lined with tin. And inside that space lay a small steel cash box. With a trembling heart, she lifted it out. It was heavy. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were stacks of banknotes, neatly bound with string, a sum far greater than she could have imagined. And beneath the money lay a leather-bound ledger and a single, sealed envelope addressed in her grandmother's familiar, steady hand. The address read simply, "For the one who holds the key." Nora carried the cash box to the table and sat down, the firelight flickering across the room, casting warm, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Her hands were steady as she broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The ink was faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. My dearest girl, if you are reading this, then the world has been unkind to you, and I am no longer there to stand between you and its hardness. I am sorry for that. I built this house for you, though I did not know your name or face when I laid the first stone. I built it for the daughter of my son, for the Bassett who would come after me and need a place to be safe. I began this house the year your grandfather died. Thomas, your uncle, was already a man with a taste for the city and for easy money. I knew then that the farm would not be safe forever. I knew he would not see it as a home, but as something to be sold. So I began to build a different kind of inheritance, one that could not be signed away or sold for profit. I bought this land quietly, and for 10 years I brought supplies up here, a little at a time. I cut every stone and set it with my own hands. I raised every beam. This house is made of my love for a future I would not see. In the cash box, you will find $5,000. It is the money from every good timber sale, every surplus calf, every bit I could save over 30 years. Use it to buy what you need, to be beholden to no one. In the ledger you will find my accounting, every nail, every pane of glass, every tool, and where it was purchased. You will also find notes on this land, where the soil is best for a garden, where the deer cross in winter, where the best fishing can be found in the creek. It is a map of this life, should you choose to live it. This house is strong. It will keep you warm in winter and cool in summer. It will stand long after we are all gone. Be good to it, and it will be good to you. Live a life of your own making, Nora. Be brave, be kind, and let the tool do the work. With all my love, your grandmother, Eleanor Bassett. Nora read the letter 3 times, her fingers tracing the faded signature. The grief she had held at bay finally broke over her, not in a storm of tears, but as a quiet, profound ache of love and loss. She was not crying for what she had lost, but for the impossible depth of what she had been given. Her grandmother had foreseen it all: the sale of the farm, the callousness of her son, the moment a 19-year-old girl would be left with nothing. And she had answered that future cruelty with a slow, patient, and monumental act of love. Nora opened the ledger. Page after page was filled with Eleanor's neat script, detailing dates, costs, and materials. June 1952, 12 bags Portland cement, $8.40 from Harmony Creek Mercantile. August 1954, 2 kegs of 16-penny nails, $11. September 1958, window glass custom cut from Missoula Glass and Trim, $43.25. It was the secret history of her grandmother's life, a testament to decades of quiet, determined labor. The money was a tool, the ledger a guide, and the house a shelter. It was everything she needed. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for the first time since her grandmother's death, Nora did not feel alone. She felt seen. She felt known. She felt finally home. The next morning, Nora woke with the sun. The grief had settled into a quiet resolve, a sense of purpose as solid as the stone walls around her. Her grandmother had not just left her a refuge. She had left her a life's work. The rebuilding began not with a grand plan, but with small, deliberate acts. First, she took a bucket and a stiff brush to the floors, scrubbing away the decades of dust until the wide pine planks shone, their grain a warm honey color in the morning light. She washed the windows until the mountain light streamed in, clear and bright. She beat the dust from the wool blankets and aired them in the sun-drenched meadow. Each task was a conversation with her grandmother, a way of saying, "Thank you, I am here. I will be a worthy steward of this gift." The money gave her the freedom to provision without fear. After a week of settling in, she walked back down the mountain to Harmony Creek, her satchel filled with a list drawn from her grandmother's ledger. At the mercantile, she met the owner again, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose calm gaze seemed to take in Nora's worn clothes and the quiet determination in her eyes. Nora did not display her wealth, but asked to open an account, placing $100 bill on the counter as a deposit. Mrs. Gable raised an eyebrow, but simply nodded, her respect earned not by the money, but by the seriousness in Nora's request for seed packets, lamp oil, and a new whetstone. It was Silas Croft, the town's carpenter and blacksmith, who became her first true ally. He was a man in his late 60s, with hands as gnarled as oak roots and a face mapped with a lifetime of quiet observation. Nora found him in his workshop, a place that smelled of sawdust and hot metal, and asked to purchase seasoned lumber to repair a section of the shed roof. He looked at her carefully. "That's a 2-day haul up the mountain for a mule team," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What's a girl like you doing with a place that needs that kind of work?" Nora simply met his gaze. "It's my place," she said, "and the work needs doing." Silas studied her for a long moment, then a slow smile touched his lips. He saw the competence in her, the echo of another woman he had known long ago who bought supplies and spoke little of her purpose. "Eleanor Bassett's girl," he said, more a statement than a question. "I'll be. I helped her haul the anvil for that forge of hers 30 years back. She was a fine builder." He agreed to sell her the lumber, and seeing the earnest set of her jaw, offered more. "I'll come up myself Saturday, help you set the rafters. An old friend's memory is worth that much." And so he did. He arrived on a sturdy mule laden with lumber and taught her how to brace the new beams, how to measure the cuts with precision, his gruff instructions a form of deep respect for her willingness to learn and work. He showed her how to heat and shape a broken hinge in the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil a kind of music that echoed in the high meadow. He asked for no payment, but accepted a hot meal and a cup of strong coffee, sitting at her table and sharing stories of her grandmother's quiet trips to town for supplies all those years ago. He was the first person to see her not as a displaced girl, but as the rightful heir to the stone house, a new homesteader in a long tradition of them. Slowly, Nora's life took on the rhythm of the seasons, her existence becoming intertwined with the house and the small community of Harmony Creek. She was no longer the lost girl who had walked out of her old life with nothing, but the Bassett girl in the stone house, a figure of quiet industry and self-reliance. Her weekly trips to town became a ritual. She would walk the now familiar trail, her pack laden with mended tools for Silas, or a jar of the wild berry jam she'd learned to make for Mrs. Gable, and return with salt, coffee, and news of the valley. Mrs. Gable would save her the day-old bread and give her a fair price for the neat bundles of dried herbs Nora gathered from the mountainside. Silas taught her how to trap, how to read the tracks of elk and deer, and how to properly cure the hides. In return, Nora used her smaller, nimbler hands to repair the intricate workings of the town's clocks and music boxes, a skill Eleanor had passed down. One afternoon, a young man named Finn, who worked the small ranch down in the valley, appeared at her meadow leading a horse. "Silas sent me," he said, his voice shy. "Said you were clearing land for a garden. This is Rose. She's old, but she'll pull a plow better than you can with that shovel." Nora offered him payment, but he shook his head. "Just a share of the first potatoes is all." Together, they spent a week turning the rich soil of the meadow, the old horse patiently leaning into the harness, the plow biting deep. Finn spoke little, but his presence was a steady comfort. They worked in a shared silence, The only sounds the jingle of the harness, the cry of a hawk overhead, and the soft thud of stone pulled from the earth. When the garden was plowed and planted according to the notes in Eleanor's ledger, Nora's place in the community had been solidified. She was a provider, a craftswoman, a neighbor. People began to seek her out. A rancher's wife brought her a stack of torn work shirts to mend, paying her in jars of fresh milk. The preacher asked her to repair a sticking key on the church organ. She was no longer living on her grandmother's savings, but on the currency of her own skills. Her inheritance transformed from a cache of money into a sustainable life. The stone house was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, a workshop, a place of belonging. It was filled with the smell of baking bread, the scent of wood smoke, and the low hum of a life being built, one sturdy, well-made piece at a time. The community had not embraced her with grand gestures, but had woven her into its fabric through 100 small, practical acts of mutual need and respect. She was one of them now. One evening in late autumn, as the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Nora sat at the heavy trestle table, the warm glow of the oil lamp pushing back the deep mountain darkness. A fire crackled in the hearth her grandmother had built, its heat radiating into the room. A steady, living presence. The air was filled with the scent of pine from the fire and the rich aroma of the venison stew simmering on the stove. Through the clean window panes, she could see the stars, sharp and brilliant in the cold, clear air. Her life had found its center. She had her garden put to bed for the winter, its bounty stored in the small root cellar she and Finn had dug. The woodshed was stacked high with firewood, enough to last until the spring thaw. The house was sound, the roof tight, the larder full. She had survived. More than that, she had thrived. On the table before her lay her grandmother's ledger, open to a page of notes on preparing for winter. Beside it lay the heavy iron key. She picked it up, its weight familiar and comforting in her palm. This small piece of metal had been the beginning of everything. It was a key not just to a house, but to a life she could not have imagined. It was the physical manifestation of her grandmother's love, a love so powerful and prescient that it had reached across death to save her. She thought of her uncle, Thomas, of his dismissive gesture and his $37. He had cast her out with what he considered to be nothing, believing he had stripped her of her inheritance. He had been wrong. He had taken the land, but he had missed the legacy entirely. Eleanor's true inheritance wasn't the 40 acres of the farm. It was the knowledge in Nora's hands, the resilience in her heart, and the quiet foresight that had built this stone house as a bulwark against the world's carelessness. Nora looked around the room, at the smooth, solid walls, the sturdy furniture, the shelves laden with provisions. Every object was a testament to her grandmother's labor and her own. This was a place built by the hands of Bassett women, a fortress of love and competence. She was not just its keeper, she was its continuation. Nora Bassett was 19 and had been left with nothing but a key and $37. She had spent it all on a map, a little flower, and a new life. It was the best $37 she had ever spent. Her story is a reminder that the greatest inheritances are not always the ones found in a will, but are sometimes hidden, waiting for the right hands to find them. They are the skills we are taught, the resilience we are shown, and the love that prepares a place for us, even when the world has cast us out. We thank you for spending this time with us tonight. For more stories of quiet strength and hidden legacies, be sure to subscribe and share this with someone who might need it. And now, we leave you with a question to carry into your week. What is the most valuable thing you have ever been given that had nothing to do with money?